welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
Tim, usually I'd say I'm doing fantastic, but if there is a word that is better than fantastic, that's how I'm feeling right now because we have a return guest on. She always brings her A game, and we always leave feeling a lot more informed than when we entered the conversation. But there's still a piece of information missing here, that being your mood. How are you?
Thank you very much for asking. I'm doing great. Especially great to reintroduce our old friend, Professor Elizabeth Yardley, who is Professor of Criminology, School of Social Sciences at Birmingham City University. And she's so smart, Lance. She sometimes will send us research papers that we just love to read. And this is what happened this time. She wrote one with Laura Richards, and it's called The Elephant in the Room, Toward an Integrated Feminist Analysis of Mass Murder. And it was a very interesting research paper, and we're so lucky to get to unpack it with Professor Liz Yardley.
Her papers never read as super heavy on the academia side. And in this paper, they're really trying to identify the why behind mass shootings and how most of them, the majority of them, have an origin in domestic abuse.
Yeah, it's a fascinating piece of work, Lance. I was blown away. I had never considered that or thought about that, and I was shocked to read all that. So yeah, it's a very interesting conversation, hopefully useful info for our listeners. And Liz also has a helpful website for anyone working on their dissertation, Lance. The website is thedegreedoctor.com. She's on Instagram and YouTube as well. I know we have a lot of student listeners. You can look up Liz and get help right from her.
And I just love this about her because no matter how busy she is, no matter what she's working on, she still takes the time educating students beyond the classroom. And Tim, for an episode like this that does not have the ads, where can someone source that, including all of our other episodes and maybe bonus shows, bonus material? Where can our listeners find that?
Great questions, Lance. Our listeners can subscribe to Crawlspace Premium right there in their Apple Podcasts app. And non-Apple users can go to crawlspace.supportingcast.fm and they can sign up there. It's $4.99 a month. They get bonus episodes, they get early releases, and it's all ad-free.
And does Crawlspace have any presence on social media?
You bet your bottom dollar, Lance. Listeners can follow us at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody.
Here is a quick word from our sponsors, and we'll return with Professor Liz Yardley.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Welcome back to the podcast, Liz Yardley. How are you today?
I am fantastic, and it's awesome to be back on the podcast again.
It's amazing to have you back on, and it's been far too long since your last appearance, but I must say, it does take me a little bit of time in between our conversations to process all of that information. So the time, while we would rather talk to you more often, is still time well spent as we continue to process what you've sent us, including this incredible paper, this article that we'll get to. But first of all, how are you? And how do you keep striving to educate and inform people and still maintain a quality of life?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? But yeah, I'm good right now. I am highly caffeinated because this is the first week back of the semester at the university I work at. And I always feel like a complete fish out of water the first week back. I've been doing this for 20 years now in some form or another. And every semester, I get that horrible, crazy imposter syndrome. Like, how does this work again? Can I do this? Oh my goodness, there are so many students. But I'm okay now. But caffeine has helped this week. Yeah, research-wise, you only really realise how much you've done when you look back on it. And we have a process in the UK called the REF, which is called the Research Excellence Framework. So essentially every 7 or 8 years or so, you have to kind of produce all of this documentation to say, here's all the research we've done at this university for this period of time. And we all kind of go back and look at what we've published and the papers we've written and all of the stuff that we've been looking at. And we go, wow, that's quite a lot. It's always a juggling act in the world of academia between all of the different hats that you're wearing. You're supporting students on a day-to-day basis. You're banging out your research. You're connecting with organisations in the community. And obviously, you're coming on fantastic podcasts like Crawlspace too.
Yeah.
Aw, thank you.
Well, thanks. Yeah.
I just want to make a quick comment. You said something really quickly that I don't want people to overlook because we know some of our peers, ourselves included, well, maybe more on my end, but our listeners, some of our peers, this concept of imposter syndrome comes up every so often, especially in what we do, because we don't come from a background of criminology or psychology, and we talk to a lot of people who are experts in that, like yourself. So there are times when we feel like that. Why are we worthy of this conversation? But having someone like you say, you go back, even after 20 years, you go back and you have that experience is so refreshing. So I just want to point that out to the people out there listening who are experiencing that. If Liz Yardley can feel degree of imposter syndrome, we can all rest easy.
Absolutely. And I think the older I've got, the more I've just completely embraced it. I mean, I have no qualms about walking into a lecture theatre full of 200 students and going, oh, I'm feeling a bit rusty. It's been a while. Hopefully this will go okay. And I think as long as you kind of take it, you know, with that good humour and just be completely, you know, open and transparent about it, you minimise it. A lot of my younger colleagues find this and they talk to you kind of privately about it every year. And you say, just embrace it, you know, because we're never going to be able to learn absolutely everything about our subject. And students are going to ask us questions and journalists are going to ask us questions and we're not going to know the answer to it. So it's best to just go, I'm sorry, I don't actually know the precise number that you're looking for. I can go and look it up for you, or I can tell you where you can find it. You just got to roll with it, you know?
Yeah. Before we get too deep, I just want to ask, what is your role at Birmingham City University?
So I am a Professor of Criminology and I work in the School of Social Sciences. So I work alongside sociologists and psychologists and people doing youth studies and Black studies. We've got a whole host of social science there. It is a social science all-you-can-eat buffet, and it's a fantastic place to work.
Tell us about your new site, the thedegreedoctor.com.
Oh, fantastic. It's great to be able to chat about this because one of the things I've really enjoyed about my time has been supporting students doing dissertations. So most students in the social sciences, in business, in the humanities, when they get to their final year of their degree, they have to do a dissertation, essentially a research project. So they go out, they collect their own data, they analyse it, they write it up. And it's one of the things that causes students so much anxiety. And it's the same for students who study at postgraduate level as well, because it's one of those kind of funny things that you do at university where you don't have an actual formal class for it. You've got to go and kind of look stuff up for yourself and figure things out on your own. And a lot of students are jumping straight onto Google. How do I write a dissertation? How many references? How do I do a literature review? What is a secondary research dissertation? And I thought, I'm going to go and provide something to help people with that. So about a year or so ago now, I set up a website called thedegreedoctor.com. Thank you very much. And a couple of social media channels alongside that. Just answering people's questions. So all of the questions that students have asked me over the last 20 years, I've been producing content around that, videos, blog posts, little tips, little graphics on Instagram. And people are finding it really helpful, which is great.
Yeah, I could see that. Thank goodness I will never write a dissertation, but if I were going to, I would go to thedegreedoctor.com and get some help from you for sure.
I think you could probably write multiple dissertations, given all the cases that you've looked at. You're an absolute expert. You just don't have the kind of document with it all in. It's all there, you know?
I look at your work cited on one of your research papers, and you literally put the research into research paper. Like I can't. 4 pages of research papers that you've read to write one of your own. It's amazing.
Yeah, I like reading. It helps. It helps in my field of work. But those kind of things can be quite intimidating for students. You come across a research paper that's 30 pages long and a lot of them are impenetrable. They're written in this academic gobbledygook that no one can understand. And you think, oh my goodness, what am I supposed to do with this? Do I have to read all of this? You know, what am I supposed to take from it? And one of the things that you read and you find your mind wandering and you're like, should I put some laundry on? Yeah, oh, I should really pop out to the shops, you know. They're quite difficult.
I think that's the reason why we love having you on, is because your papers that you send us, I mean, they have the academic tone to them, but it hooks you. Once you get that hook in you, you keep going in, and if you've gone into it knowing that you want to learn about this, it's almost impossible to pull yourself out of it, even if you do have laundry to do or something like that. Especially this one here. I think this is your most frightening and important one that you've ever sent to us. I want to go back just a little bit on your work with the degree doctor. When you think about something like that, And you also know that you have all of these other things on your plate, and you realize that this is something that you're doing as an extra thing for people. This is because you are passionate about educating people. Where did that come from?
Yeah, I think it was probably during the pandemic when we all had a little bit of extra time. And I'm one of those people who doesn't kind of sit still very much. I'm not great with, having time on my hands. So I started thinking about, yeah, I know. So I started thinking about doing this kind of thing. There were people all around setting up online businesses, doing stuff that they'd dreamt of doing for years. And I thought, I've always wanted to do something like this. So I started developing some ideas and spoke to family about it and wrote to a few people in from my family to help me with it. It's just a kind of natural progression, really. I think sometimes you get to a stage in your career where you want a bit of a change of direction. You want to start looking at something a bit new, even though that's drawing on stuff that you've already done. And I remember, that's why I went into academia in the first place, because I remember looking at my lecturers and my professors at university thinking, that's pretty cool that they get to help people all day, their knowledge and their studies, and they're teaching people how to be better students and make sure that the information they're finding is valid and reliable. And this was in the days before the internet went, completely mainstream. And now I think it's more important than ever that you help students out in finding valid sources of information. That's one of the biggest things that I advise people on. And it's a real kind of area where people ask a lot of questions on. It's like, can I use this in my dissertation? And I'm like, probably not. I'm absolutely loving it. Yeah, we're hearing from students all over the world, which is brilliant. I've always loved being able to support the students around me, in my own institution. That's great. But when you get emails from, literally the other side of the world and people saying, oh, I found that blog post really helpful, I'm like, oh, that feels good.
Good, yeah. Liz, this new research paper that you sent us is called The Elephant in the Room, Toward an Integrated Feminist Analysis of Mass Murder, and you co-wrote this with Laura Richards.
Yes, the lovely Laura.
Yeah, she's fantastic as well. Can you tell us a little bit about this paper?
I've always been interested in, the phenomenon of multiple murder. And it's something that we often think of as there are so few cases of that. And it's kind of, detached from, most of us in our everyday lives. We're not really, personally affected by it unless we're really unlucky. And it was almost treated like that in the academic sense as well. Nobody had thought that actually people who do these kind of things share values and beliefs and thought patterns with other members of society who don't go on and do that kind of thing. When I started looking into it, looking at some of the research literature around it, looking at what some of the journalists have been writing about in terms of misogyny and backgrounds of domestic abuse, I was like, okay, we need to really make that solid connection between the two. And we found that a lot of most perpetrators of mass homicides have a history of domestic abuse, whether that's been reported and recorded or not. They have this tendency to think in these rather misogynistic terms. I think it's a real missed opportunity because domestic abuse has always been the poor relation, really, when it comes to criminal justice. And we've got that terrible term, just a domestic. That crime was just a domestic. Nothing to see here. Move along. It's what happens behind closed doors. It's none of anybody else's business. But it becomes everyone else's business. So being able to join up the dots and look at mass murder as a phenomenon and say these guys, they don't just suddenly emerge from the bowels of hell one day. They don't go from normal, healthy, functioning individuals on Friday to committing mass homicide on Saturday. There's a process there. And there's an underlying belief system and a value system, which is actually quite common. So it's something that we're always trying to kind of bring to the fore. And Laura is always talking about these issues as well. These guys are not the exception to the rule. They are much greater in number than we realise. And we can see this with things like the incel movement as well. This goes back to the murders committed by Elliot Rodger and the kind of fan community that emerged around that. And it's really worrying stuff.
One thing that this paper doesn't explore is firearms, guns. Every time a mass shooting happens, that is basically the only conversation in the media. And it's political all the time, always as well. But I love that this is just a different approach. It even starts further back, I would argue, than, someone buying a gun.
Absolutely. It's the motive behind why people do these things. And their access to weapons is obviously a factor in it in terms of the scale that they're able to carry out these atrocities on. But the thought patterns are the same. The decision making, the sense of entitlement, that's there, and that's quite common across the board. But yeah, I always find it really depressing that whenever something like this happens, the conversation immediately goes to availability of firearms. And that's an important factor, obviously. But there is this other thing in the background, this belief system, this sense of entitlement to go out and do this kind of thing. And there are lots of warning signs there in these cases. We just need to know what to look for.
I actually got a little bit excited when reading this because you brought up neoliberalism. And that comes up a lot. I understand the consequences of that as a political ideology, how it increases poverty, it increases wage gaps. It's so charged in this sense of entitlement, like you said. So I understand the consequences only because I think of my age right now and being aware through how information can come to people, and you can see it now. You can see how that ideology has had the ramifications on certain populations. However, I've always had a hard time trying to wrap my head around the definition itself. I know it predates like Ronald Reagan and the 80s, but that's when it started to become popular. So can you just help us out with the actual definition of that, how that is considered one of the root causes of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, it's essentially about the relationship between the individual and the state. And this goes back to the economist Adam Smith, back in, I think, the 1700s, but don't quote me on that. And this is essentially the idea that you need to leave the economy alone. So if you have too much government interference in the economy, it can only be a bad thing. And the market will always kind of correct itself and find its natural equilibrium. The philosophy is that government kind of takes a step back from interfering in people's lives, and it allows the systems of the market to basically, work naturally. And if you do that, everybody will be looked after as long as they work hard. When we got into the late 70s, the 80s, we got Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, very much proponents of neoliberalism. It had taken on another kind of element by then about personal responsibility. And whenever you start talking about personal responsibility, you are kind of dividing people. You're saying there are people who take personal responsibility and there are people who don't, and there we have that kind of them and us start to emerge. Neoliberalism, we're starting to talk about it more in criminology now, but for many years it was something that we never really kind of looked very hard at. It's really important for me because it helps us situate crime, situate harm in the bigger picture, because yes, individuals make decisions and choices every day, but that happens within a wider context. There's a backdrop to that, the scenery, and that is impacting individuals' choices and behaviors. So when we think about, the kind of obsession with the individual, and it results in this kind of quite selfish individual, because it's, well, I've got to look out for myself then. If that's how things are, I've got to look after number one. And that can lead to particular types of behavior, particular outlooks on the world. And all of this does connect up with crime in terms of people's decision making around it. It also connects up with how we react to people who commit crime and how we react to people who are victims of crime. And one of the things that I find very often in domestic abuse, it's one of those areas which is kind of a bit different, because we're very quick to kind of blame the victim in cases of domestic abuse and say, oh, why didn't she just leave? Or why didn't he just leave? Why did they keep taking them back? And we don't kind of back up and go, hang on a minute, the why questions, shouldn't we be asking those of the perpetrator? Like, why did they decide to behave in this way in the first place? There's a real kind of disconnect there when it comes to that. And I think that is partly because of the emphasis that the neoliberal kind of belief system places on the sanctity of the family, the nuclear family. We should preserve the nuclear family, at all costs. Therefore, anybody who's kind of rocking the boat with that, they're kind of seen less favorably. So yeah, that was a very long answer to your question.
It's a great answer. And you brought up the nuclear family as well. And that's something that started coming into our culture in the 50s and 60s, sort of right alongside the invention of the microwave oven. Personally, I feel like it's something that absolutely destroyed the concept of a family. When they were trying to enhance the concept of the family, they were simultaneously taking that away. I feel like that is all kind of lumped into this one bucket that we're talking about. How all of these boxes that you need to check in order to be the perfect family are actually just designed to create more tension.
It's really interesting because when we look at the kind of rise of the nuclear family, I mean, there have always been nuclear families to some degree. People who kind of subscribe to a sort of Marxist perspective would say that the nuclear family is there to kind of serve the needs of the capitalist system, because you have this very compact little unit able to move around and follow the work where the work goes, and you have some quite rigidly defined roles within those households, and it works for capitalism. But when we think of how that applies today, how that applies in the world that we're living in now, we look at the family in terms of crime and in terms of harm. It does have a really dark side to it when we look at domestic abuse and we look at crimes that are connected. And I think it's really great to be having conversations like these, to be stepping back and going, okay, well, when did society kind of start changing? When did we start heralding this as the one and the only way, to live our lives? And what impact does that then have on people who don't conform to that? Back in the 80s, the kind of stigmatization and demonization of single mothers and people who are reliant on, state welfare for a particular period of their lives, they were seen as kind of less than. And so all of these things have an impact. They really do. And we've had a tendency in criminology, especially in criminal psychology as well, to look very much at the individual and their behavior, and not to kind of zoom out and go, well, what's happening more broadly, and how might that be connected with the decisions that people are making? And it's not to excuse people's behavior when they decide to do bad stuff, but it helps to explain it. People are often very kind of reluctant to speak kind of publicly about this as criminologists, because when they start talking about the context and the bigger picture, people go, oh, but you're just excusing them, you're saying poor them, and they couldn't help what they did. And that's not what we're saying at all. We're saying we need to look at that and not use it as an excuse, but use it as a way of developing an explanation and saying, well, what can we do about this?
Well, what can we do? I guess now that we know domestic abuse is common in mass killers,
I think just start taking it a hell of a lot more seriously. It's quite depressing when you look at some of the actual facts around domestic abuse. I mean, it was still completely legal in England and Wales, where I live, for a man to rape his wife within marriage until the early 1990s. It wasn't a crime like before then, and we didn't start to see like really significant pieces of legislation emerging until very, very recently. So we had the Domestic Abuse Act in this country in 2021. And I'm like, wow, that took a while. And often these kind of things are kind of pushed to the side because it's more important that we stabilize the economy, that we, look at economic growth, that we look at other important things that are going on. And when you look at how many people this affects as well, it's pretty staggering. I think it's take it more seriously. I say like legislation is important. Having laws against, this kind of behavior and this kind of harm is important, but it requires a cultural change as well. You can change the law all you want, but if the people enforcing the law, if the people on the front line, the police officers, are not kind of on side with that, it's kind of wasting your time, really. I think recently, the Gabby Petito case was a very interesting one. I remember looking at some of the body cam footage from the police officers, and just the way that they were interacting with her and with the guy in this situation. There was a real kind of bro type thing going on. And I was like, there's not much impartiality there, is there? There is almost this connection between, the suspect and the officers, which is quite damaging, especially for somebody who is a victim of domestic abuse. And that kind of thing goes on, and we see it every day. I know in the area that I live in, there were several young women, university students, kind of going out at night, and some of them were being attacked. There was a female police officer who was looking after these victims, and she would say to them things like, oh, you girls, you go out and you get drunk and you get yourself into these situations, and I have to deal with it. This happened like last year, 2022. But I'm like, it's 2022 and police officers still have these attitudes. Some of them still have these attitudes, not all of them. And female police officers as well. And I think that's one thing that we tend to overlook as well. This isn't a kind of man-hating thing. This is a domestic abuse hating thing. Women can be misogynistic as much as men can. And it often gets anybody who has feminist on their biography, on their social media, gets so much stick for it. And they get labeled as kind of man haters and crazy feminists. But, domestic abuse and misogyny and all of that thing, it's just as bad for men as it is for women, and men are our allies in the fight against this kind of thing.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
I thought that your observation about Gabby Petito is really interesting. She's there in that video kind of breaking down. And like you said, they're kind of like elbowing with Brian, I think his name was. And they almost just like, oh, she's having a moment or something, you know, we'll let you guys go.
Don't mind her, she's crazy.
The group of statistics that spoke to me most in your paper was that men are 94% likely to be the perpetrators of a mass shooting. Women are more likely to be victims of mass murder, 43%, but only 23% of homicide victims in general are women.
Yeah.
That's a huge difference in numbers there.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks volumes to mass murder when we look at the overrepresentation of female victims in cases like this. Because when we look at homicide, men are the majority of perpetrators on the whole, but they're also the majority of victims. This is very much a kind of male-dominated crime on both sides. But when you start looking into particular types of homicide, it gets really interesting. Mass homicide, we see women overrepresented as victims. Domestic homicide, we see women overrepresented as victims. And I think we need to look more carefully at these statistics and say, what are they suggesting? They're suggesting that these subcategories of murder are heavily gendered. So your experience of it is going to vary depending on your gender. There's a reason for that socially, isn't there? Because if this was completely down to chance, it'd be 50-50 down the middle, but it's not. And the same goes for homicide in general too. Men overrepresented as victims, men overrepresented as perpetrators. What does that tell us? What does that tell us about masculinity and violence and the valuing of violence and the association? We need to look more closely at this kind of stuff.
And you really did, because you referenced the University of Texas shooting that happened in 1966, and it's, I believe, commonly called the University of Texas Tower shooting, because this is the one where the perpetrator was in the tower shooting people with a rifle, I believe. And I don't think a lot of people knew, and I certainly didn't know, that it started off with him killing his wife.
Yeah, I didn't know that either until I started doing this piece of research, because that's the one thing that you'll come across when you start researching mass homicide, mass murder, is this seminal case that happened in the 1960s. And you find out a few details out about it. And it's, oh, he was shooting people from the clock tower. It was a really awful event. When you start digging into it more deeply, people who've done, more thorough research about it, that happened after, he killed female members of his own family. We just don't know about that. And we find similar things as well. And this is something that Laura is always saying, Laura Richards, who I co-authored the paper with. Whenever there is a case of mass homicide and she's interviewed about it, she says, I can predict exactly what's going to happen next. Here's what we're going to find out about this individual. There will be a history of domestic abuse. There will be a history of stalking, of that kind of behavior. And every single time she is spot on.
Is this something that is a connection to that entitlement or that masculinity that you're talking about, where the perpetrator will kill his wife, will kill female members of his family, and then realize he's probably going to get caught? So now it's going to be a spectacle? Where's the difference between just stopping at the wife and the mom and then I'm going up to the top of the clock tower?
Underlying all violence is shame. So you see that come out in cases of mass homicide. So you have the
I just had a wow
homicide.
moment. Oh my God, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's so true though, isn't it? That is the root. Every single violent incident, you will be able to identify the perpetrator's shame somewhere in there. And that's what is driving the violence. That's what's driving the behavior. You have this individual who has this very kind of proprietorial sense over his own family, sense of entitlement, to do what he wants with those people. When you look at these situations, they don't look at their family in the same way that we all look at our families, as individuals to be loved and cherished, and, they're on an equal footing with us, and there's respect and mutuality there. With perpetrators of this kind of crime, family is a possession. It's something that is owned. It's something that is, I worked for this. It is mine. These individuals aren't, autonomous, free-willed, people who can do what they want. They are people who the perpetrator owns and controls, and he's the one who calls the shots, and they are not going to get a say in what happens. We see this in many cases of family annihilators as well, people who kill multiple members of their own family. This is mine, I own this. And the reason that they feel like that is because of some underlying shame. The need to want to control other people always comes from a sense of kind of shame within yourself. And I find it really interesting. I mean, we've had this recent case of Brian Koberger, who's the suspect in this multiple murder. Very often when I look at the victims of a crime like this, every single time they embody everything that the perpetrator isn't. You've got these young people who are at college, they're doing really well. You look at photos of them, they're all smiling, they're happy, they're having the time of their lives. You can guarantee that the person who has committed these murders is the exact opposite of that. This is somebody who is not having the time of their lives. This is somebody who is a loner. This is somebody who feels really resentful about that as well. How dare these people get to have this experience of life and I don't? You know, there's a very much kind of narcissistic side to perpetrators of this kind of thing. So yeah, shame, it's the root of everything. And every single case that I've looked at over the years, whether academically or whether for some of the TV work, it's like, right, where's the shame? Okay, there it is. You know, that's the fuel that's behind all of it. And the one thing that I'll say about shame as well, because it's kind of a societal thing. I mean, we all have a degree to which we feel ashamed in some way. And we were talking about imposter syndrome earlier. So that kind of comes into it as well. But the people who turn that shame into violence against other people, there are some other factors, I think, cooking away for them as well. So they're very much grown up with the idea that violence is to be valued, that controlling and harming other people is something that's to be valued. So you get other factors that fall into play as well and create the circumstances in which this happens.
Can you unpack that a little more? The violence is to be valued part?
There's so much interesting work on this in criminology. I would love to point people towards a school of thought called ultra-realism, which was developed by Simon Winlow and Steve Hall, who are two criminology professors here in the UK. They look at persistently violent men, largely in the northeast of England, which is very much a post-industrial region. It had a very thriving mining and shipbuilding, those kind of physical, hard manual labour up until the 1970s. You look at areas where you have got that kind of really hard manual work. You know, people are tough, people are stoic, people are resilient. And there's very much a valuing of the capacity for violence, because physically you need to be really strong to do that kind of work. So when you get areas like these and they lose those industries, they still have that culture that remains underneath. And there is this valuing of physicality, of stoicism, of resilience, and it has no outlet. You often find in these places that people engage in pursuits that enable them to kind of live that value system. And it doesn't have to be, you know, all illegal and nasty and harmful to other people. You know, it might be things like, you know, organized boxing, you know, working on the door of a nightclub, something that involves, you know, your physical strength being an asset to you, essentially. So their work is absolutely fascinating. And they've done ethnographic research, which essentially means they've gone and hung around with people and spent time with them and you know, gone to the pub with them and talked to them about their lives and their experiences. It's really, really interesting and compelling stuff. And again, it's that zooming out. It's like, okay, we see people behaving in this way, and there's this area that we're going to go and do research in. And oh, this area kind of went to pot in the 1970s and during the rise of neoliberalism. So what impact did that have on individual people's behavior? You know, it's absolutely compelling stuff. It's really interesting.
I want to add a statistic to what we were talking about just a moment ago. 42% of mass murder victims were family members of the perpetrator, and that's true in only 30% of single homicides. Which I found eye-opening. So many good statistics in this paper. What statistics surprised you the most?
Depressingly, I don't think I was really surprised by many of them, because I've been working in this area for a while. When you see them again, you see them in black and white there on the page, that they really do hit home, that this is something that is a significant problem. Just going back to that statistic that you were talking about there, when we think about mass shooting, mass homicide, we get these images of this gunman on the rampage, you know, taking out people indiscriminately. We see it as something that's almost like some kind of natural disaster. And oh God, it must be so unlucky to get caught up in something like that. It plays to this idea of kind of stranger danger, that actually the people that we live with, the people in our families, don't pose any risk to us. The danger's on the outside. But actually the reverse is true. when we look at women's experiences of violence and children's experiences of violence, it's not the creepy guy hanging out in the bushes in the park. It's not the local sex offender. It's from within your own family, the highest risk. I think that's something that sits really uncomfortably with people, but unfortunately, it's a reality. And many of us, fortunately, we've never had those kind of experiences, and we never will. But there are lots of people who do. And I think this continued sort of denial of it, and this talking about violence as something that happens out there. It's okay, we shut our door, we're safe behind our door, we set our intruder alarm, and everything is well and good with the world, isn't always true. And I think it's a very kind of harsh reality and an inconvenient truth. Not to quote Al Gore, but popped straight into my head there. But it's something that we do need to really kind of face up to, I think, a lot more than we do.
How does pop culture influence this?
There is just so much visibility now, isn't there? And I think we all want to be performing on this stage to other people. And when we look at the behavior of mass killers, we often take a look at their Instagram, we take a look at their Twitter, and that can be something that's so revealing about who they are. And it's this wanting to be seen, to be a particular type of person, wanting to be validated, wanting to be acknowledged, wanting to be better than other people. And again, we come back to those neoliberal values, don't we? This demonic desire to win all the time, to come out on top. There's also this notion of, if I'm going to win, someone else has to fail for me to win. I can't just win and be like, hey, I did this great thing, isn't that wonderful? It's like, I did this great thing, isn't that wonderful? And that person came second. Ha! It's that comes into it as well. We do have to really consider this kind of performativity, this need to always be, putting on a performance, and the kind of people we're portraying ourselves to be, and how that is perhaps impacting these kind of crimes. And quite a few years ago now, I wrote a book called Social Media Homicide Confessions, which basically looked at what murderers were doing on social media around the murders that they committed. And this kind of performativity came across really strongly in that as well. It's wanting to be seen, to be recognised as somebody, not to be messed with. And then, when they are arrested and they are charged, the narrative kind of changes there. They want to portray themselves as the victim. They don't have access to their social media anymore, but a lot of the stuff that you see about them in mainstream media is, oh, poor me.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Just said that about how these types of people always want to win, but it's not just enough to win. They have to highlight the fact that they have beat somebody else. And sometimes what they're winning at is the issue that they created in the first place. So they've already set themselves up to win, and then they can just simply call someone a loser. I couldn't help, and I don't want to bring Donald Trump's name into this, but I couldn't help think of that. That was his entire platform. It's amazing how much damage can be done in one word, one message.
It's one of those cultural components that we see in everybody's behaviour. And this is one of the things that I'm always really kind of keen to get across. When we look at people who commit homicide, multiple homicide, single homicide, we treat them as these kind of aberrations. They're not like the rest of us. Like I said earlier, they came straight from the bowels of hell. It's not actually like that. They grow up in the same society as us, often hold many similar values to the ones that we hold. And this is one of the things that I always kind of come back to, that people who do the most horrendous things, very often they're not the antithesis of the values that we all hold. They're not the exact opposite of them. They're the extreme embodiment of them. They are kind of taking this kind of neoliberal ethos to the nth degree. This is what we're seeing. And we want to say that they're abnormal and they're evil, because then we can just tuck them away and forget about them. But this kind of thing keeps happening, like again and again and again. And I think until we address some of these issues, until we acknowledge that, the desire to win, the selfish individualism, all of this stuff, which all of us are kind of part and parcel of, is very much at the core of some of the most horrendous crimes that we see.
What do you learn when there is a mass shooting or a mass murder and you check out the media? What should we be taking from that? And what should we be observing that we probably aren't?
I think there's this kind of common narrative that happens with like the press coverage of a mass murder. And you almost get the kind of the panicky response to it. And you get this thing coming across almost as if it's the stranger thing, it's the danger from the outside again. Because in the immediate aftermath of a mass homicide, people are like worried for their own safety, you know, especially if the perpetrator hasn't been apprehended. We tend to be very much focused on body count, you know, and, you know, how much visual impact this particular crime had, how many great pictures can be shown of it, what kind of is highly clickable, and some of the less powerful doesn't really get covered. So talking about somebody's history of domestic abuse, or, you know, violence or stalking or whatever, it's not a headline grabber. And there's this concept in criminology called news values. And these are essentially the unwritten rules of journalism. And they're the things that decide what cases get covered and what cases don't. And this often feeds into the narrative around particular crimes. That the simpler you can keep it, the better. There's a checklist essentially of these values. And you kind of see that playing out in cases of mass homicide as well. It's like, oh, I see why this one's made the news. But there was some really interesting research done several years ago now, that said that even some cases of mass homicide don't really get covered outside of the city or the state in which they happen, because they're not ticking those boxes for the more newsworthy elements of it.
What does that say about the media? What does it say about us? I mean, how can we button up that point and not be totally depressed with both sides of the
Yeah, I think that you guys offer this great alternative, though, to this kind of box ticky media, mainstream media sort of narrative that is followed every single time, because you guys ask the awkward questions. I never get asked the kind of things that you ask me by mainstream media journalists, because they have 2 minutes to cover this on the news, or they've got, you know, one paragraph in the paper. They don't want me banging on about neoliberalism and post-industrial decline and that kind of stuff. But you guys are already, you know, breaking the mold through what you're doing. You're looking at it from a different perspective. And the great thing I love about you guys is you're curious. You're like, oh, tell me more about that. And mainstream journalists don't tend to ask me that. They're like, right, 5 minutes is up, I gotta go.
Why is there so long in between you coming back on? Because you raised a point, I got depressed about it, and you managed to answer my question and compliment us at the same time. So I'm elevated again. Thank you.
That was pretty good.
That was skillful.
Yeah, I remember I started listening to you guys years ago with the Maura Murray case. And what I loved about the coverage of that case was the deep dive into it. You were asking the awkward questions. You were going, but why? And why did this happen? And how come we never found out about this? And this is the kind of stuff that we should be doing, going, actually, let's look at all the questions everyone else is asking, and then go, okay, well, what other questions are there that we haven't asked and that we haven't answered?
Well, here's one right now, Liz. Brian Koberger was studying criminology. Does that hit home to you in a way that it doesn't to us, I guess, or a random person, or even a professor?
Occasionally, I think because of the nature of the subject, and you find this with psychology as well, especially forensic psychology, you do occasionally get odd folk studying this kind of thing. And if you think about Stephen Griffiths, the so-called crossbow cannibal in this country, he was a PhD student at a university in the north of England. He was imprisoned for killing 3 women several years ago. Yeah, when that case happened, a lot of my colleagues, and in the years subsequently, you know, it did cause them to look twice at people who were applying to do PhDs, especially around really violent crimes. Like, I mean, Stephen Griffith was looking at the history of murder. He was particularly interested in Jack the Ripper. So it does attract a certain kind of person sometimes. I must say, like, most PhD students, the vast majority of PhD students are not odd folk. They are people who are doing this because they're passionate about and they're interested in a topic. And I always tend to find that my PhD students, there's a personal interest in it. They know somebody who's been affected by the kind of crime that they want to do a PhD on, or their lives in some way have been shaped by a particular event, and they want to add to the knowledge and they want to change things and they want to make a difference. When we come across people like Griffiths and Brian Koberger, I think when we look at their motives for studying this kind of thing, it's altogether different. There is a tendency to want to kind of lose themselves in studying violence against other people, because that is something that kind of makes them feel better and feel powerful. And there's always an arrogance as well that we come across with offenders who are highly educated. They think they're so smart, and they trip themselves up in the most ludicrous ways. They really do. I don't think that's a huge part of this case. I mean, he hasn't gone and done a PhD in criminology and it's taught him how to, get away with, particular types of crime, because obviously he's a suspect in this case, and he's the main suspect in this case. And I think it would appeal to people like Stephen Griffiths, people like Brian Koberger. I think, this level of study is often quite appealing to them, because you talk to many PhD students and the one thing that they'll say to you is, God, doing a PhD can be so isolating. And they say, and this is the downside of it, but for some people, that's actually quite good, because they get to kind of lose themselves and they're not particularly socially adept anyway, and it kind of feeds their obsessive and their fixated nature that you often tend to find with these people.
So I just have one final question. How do we tackle this and remove ourselves from this misogynistic, patriarchal grip that we're in? I mean, it feels like this could be something that is almost impossible.
You can't change the world, but you can change the little bit of it around you. So for me, it's about, I will call out stuff that I see in my everyday life. So, if members of my family, inadvertently often, come out with stuff that's a bit misogynistic, and I'll say, hang on a minute, what do you mean by that? And just challenging some of the assumptions that we make about people, and just our kind of everyday practices, really. The big one for me, one of my friends got married recently, and I remember at the ceremony, there was the kind of signing of the certificate and everything. And on the certificate, it asked for your father's occupation, but not your mother's. And it's like, are we still doing that? It's these small changes, these things like that. And many people will listen to me talking about that and go, oh, well, that is such a minor thing. Get off your soapbox, you silly academic. But I think those things make a difference. Those little details, things that we come to completely take for granted. And I think that's one of the great things about studying social sciences, is it enables you to step back and look at the take for granted behaviours and go, why do we do that? Why don't we do this? What would be the issue with doing this differently? So I think for me, kind of tackling misogyny is just calling out the small stuff, because if all of us call out the small stuff, that's going to result in much kind of bigger incremental changes. I don't know whether I've become a bit kind of and skeptical and bitter and twisted about like the big changes, like trying to get policy changes through and getting involved in campaigns to change the law. And I always end up, terribly disappointed. Because even when you do manage to kind of push stuff onto the political agenda, often the change that happens is a very diluted version of what it is that you've campaigned for or asked for. So I think the differences that we can make are in the immediate world around us.
A great answer.
And you just made me realize that I did a very misogynistic thing with my sister about a year ago, and I meant it from like a good place, because she had got a divorce and she still had her ex-husband, and they get along, they're friendly, but she still had his last name. And I said, why don't you change it back to our last name? And she said, it's such a pain in the ass to do that. It's honestly not worth it. And I was thinking, but that's your name. And when you're talking about that, I realized how unintentionally misogynistic that was, because that's actually really not her name either. That's my dad's name. That's on the man's side. That's on the male side. And if she wants to take her ex-husband's name or our last name or any last name, that's up to her. That's not for me to tell her to do.
Pick a name, any name. Knock yourself out.
Go
love.
for it.
Yeah. And I must admit, actually, that's really interesting, because when I got married, I didn't change my name, and I didn't think that it would cause an issue, but it so did. It's like, and it was almost taken as a bit of a personal kind of insult to my husband's family, and it's like, no, it's not like that at all. This is the name that I've used for many years, and I've got this far up in my career with it. I don't want to change it. And my relationship with my dad, who sadly passed away a year or so ago, I want to kind of carry this name on, for him. And it's not about any of that stuff. But yeah, this stuff around changing your name. Yeah, when women get married, often it's, oh, so what will your new name be? And this is the great thing about if you study for a PhD and you're a woman, whenever anybody asks you, is it Miss or Mrs., you go, neither. It's Doctor.